We are streaming now.
Claire, do you want me to kick it off?
Sure, that would be great. Thanks, Sarah.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. We'd like to thank you for joining us this evening for our Recreational Trails Master Plan Public Information Session. My name is Sarah Sweeney, and I'm the Director of Parks, Recreation, and Culture, and it is my pleasure to be working on this project and to have you joining us tonight. We know you're all very busy people with lots on the go, and we appreciate you spending your time with us. Claire will be leading you through this workshop this evening, and as the person you'll be seeing and hearing from the most. And Claire's been just great to work with, tons of experience in the local area as well. And we're really excited about the collaboration that we're going to come up with to bring forward our first Trails Master Plan. So I won't delay, as I know she has much to go through, but just wanted to thank you all for joining us tonight, and take it away, Claire.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I will just echo the same sentiments. We really appreciate the time that you've taken this evening. We know time is precious. I also have a very excitable dog outside my door who is wondering why I am sitting in front of my computer at 7 p.m. But we will be here for about an hour and a half. And we hope that that time will be really meaningful and engaging for you. We will be speaking about the status of the Recreational Trails Master Plan to date. And Sarah already gave me a very lovely introduction, but my name is Claire Bashinsky. I'm a Senior Project Manager with SEMA Plus. My area of focus is in active transportation, trails, cycling, and generally recreational and active mobility planning. I've had the pleasure of working throughout Niagara region for a number of the area municipalities, as was mentioned, and it's been a wonderful experience working for the town of Grimsby so far and really engaging as we go through the process. I'm joined by two of my colleagues here today, and maybe I'll just ask them to give a wave hello, if they wouldn't mind. Gilly Thompson and Samantha Legere. Sam is actually a past resident of the town of Grimsby, and her parents still live there. So we have gotten a lot of wonderful field work and due diligence and excellent intel from her throughout this process, and we're really appreciative. So without further ado, we will get into the presentation, as we mentioned. In terms of tonight's objectives, we're really hoping to start this process by giving you a bit of a sense of the intents and purposes and the foundations of the Recreational Trails Master Plan. We want to go over what we've done so far in terms of our own background work and information, and create a bit more of an understanding around how we're approaching this plan and what some of the key considerations and foundations are. I see a couple of friendly faces in the audience, so some of you may have seen some of this information before. I can promise some of the information is also new, so hopefully that won't be too overwhelmingly repetitive for you, because we have moved forward with a couple of really interesting items when it comes to the network. As I said, we'll be here for about an hour and a half, now about an hour and 20 minutes. I promise I won't keep you beyond 8:30 unless you have some burning questions that you'd just like to ask us, in which case we're happy to answer them. But because of the size of the group, it's not too big. We are really hoping that this will be a little bit more of a dialogue and a discussion. So if you do have any questions, if you would like to raise any comments, you are welcome to raise your hand and add those and unmute yourself as you go through that process to let us know what you're thinking. We have a couple of designated spots in the presentation where we're going to be asking for those. So if you could wait until that time, that would be great, but we'll also keep an eye just in case there are some questions that need some immediate response. We're happy to do that as well. So to get the ball rolling, I've talked a little bit about how we are looking to engage, but I see many of you have yourselves muted already. That's very helpful. If you'd like to keep your video on, not a problem. I do like to see friendly and smiling faces. We won't use the chat function, as I understand that is not on in this particular meeting. And for those who are possibly live streaming, this is really more of a listening opportunity. If you'd like to, and if you are able to, and if you have questions, submit those through our Let's Talk Grimsby page. We'd be happy to answer them after the meeting, and we'll be posting all of these materials on the page afterwards as well. But to get the ball rolling, we thought we would just start with a couple of inviting questions to get a sense of who is here. And we're going to be using a tool called Menti. So if you'd like to bring up your smartphone or a web browser and type in www.menti.com, you can see that on the screen here. It'll ask you for an access code. And I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to start sharing my other screen, which shows you the tool in its real time. We're going to be able, can you see that screen with a bit of an interactive tool? Thumbs up if that is. Share screen is paused. Oh, great, excellent. Let's try that again. Always needing a bit of technical prowess. Any luck on that one? Excellent, thank you for the thumbs up. Hopefully the first question will come up for you and we'll give you a couple of options. So in this case, I'm going to go back to the beginning. And the first question is, are you a resident of the town of Grimsby? Want to get a sense of who's joining and from where? Rob, I see your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yeah, just the code. I was entering it and then you got out of the screen. What is the code again?
It should be at the top of the screen.
Oh, yeah, I see.
But if not, it is 83 79 77 84. So are you joining us and are you a resident of the town? And you may see some somewhat repetitive questions from the survey if you were able to complete it on Let's Talk Grimsby. But we also just want to know who's joining here today. Okay. And you're not obligated to participate, not a problem at all. I'll just keep looking for kind of that magic number and keep the ball rolling as we go through the process. I'm going to move on to the next question. So how frequently generally would you say that you are using the trails in Grimsby now on this spectrum of options and opportunities? And I know that for me, also my trail use where I live locally changes very frequently, sometimes depending on the week, the day, the weather's getting a little bit chillier. So can appreciate that those things change, but frequency, and we'll see some interesting response similarities, I'm sure, between this and some of our survey results. Wonderful. The last response had 3. I'm seeing a couple more come in, so hopefully some have logged in as well. That's great. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question in the interest of time. But seeing, like I said, some similarities with some of the previous responses we've seen, which is really interesting. How do you usually like to use the trails? If you could rank them in order of use, and we know that there are a lot of other uses, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But what are some of those frequencies of use, and how do you use trails right now? When we talk about trails, this is probably one of the biggest areas of conversation, how people use them, how we design for those different uses, and how we consider how to make sure that everybody feels safe and comfortable in doing so. So that will be part of the conversation that we have today, absolutely. Wonderful. See, even more coming in, so that's great, thank you.
I think Rob might have a question, or maybe his hand is still up from last time.
Great point. Thanks, Gilly. Rob, is that a new question, or is that okay? I see it down, so I think we're okay. Thank you. And do you have a favorite trail in Grimsby right now? Is there one you could name that would be at the top of your list? I like the pensive look. Sorry, Jimmy, I didn't mean to call you out, but I liked how pensive and thoughtful you were being about that. I know. And when I wrote this question, I must admit, sometimes I thought to myself, you know, this becomes an interesting question of, can you name that trail? Do you know what the name is of a trail? Is it a description of a trail that you use? That's something we're also going to be talking about a little bit later, and something that we'll be exploring through this process. Not surprising in terms of some of the responses we're seeing here and the frequency at which we are seeing them. So that's great. And there aren't too many more questions. Again, just kind of getting the lay of the land without taking up too much time. Great. Okay. 7 seemed to be the magic number we were working with, so I'm going to move on from that. And then when you think of trails in Grimsby now, what words come to mind? Some great responses in the Let's Talk page on this, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But just in case maybe you didn't have a chance to complete that, for those who are joining tonight, anything come to mind when you think of trails in Grimsby now? What would be some words that come to mind? Whether it's your experience or how you feel on them, or yeah, wonderful. And these word bubbles are some of my favorite, how dynamic the tool is. Wonderful. Well, if anything, I'm feeling very positive about the consistency of the information and the input that we're getting. Like I said, in some of the next couple of slides, you'll be seeing maybe some similarities here. And I believe this is the last question, but how do you think specifically the town could improve trails? And I'm sure you will see some similarities between what some of the words were on the past slide, as well as what some of the improvements could be. That's absolutely fine. But what do you think could really make the town just that exceptional trail destination, not just within Niagara region, but within Ontario, GTHA, beyond, that sort of thing? More connections and network. I suspected that we may see that when I saw lacking connectivity in the last one. And again, not uncommon when it comes to trails. It can be actually quite challenging to have a fully connected trails network. And not to spoil and not to tease, that is definitely something we'll be talking about throughout the presentation. Signs and communication. Excellent. More connectivity beyond the borders. Simple yet ambitious, more of them. I like it. Wonderful. Okay. So we're at about 7:20 now, and I would like to jump into the presentation. So thank you so much. And as I talk, please feel free to add. Thank you so much for participating in this tool. This is the only interactive tool that we have this evening from a virtual perspective. Like I said, the rest of the evening will be more question and answer, dialogue, and discussion. So we've already had a great example of a hand up and a question. Please continue to do that if you are joining us through Zoom. And as I said before, if you are joining us through the live stream, thank you so much. And we will be happy to answer any questions that you may have through our Let's Talk page or through any of our other avenues of engagement after the meeting, if you do have a chance to do that. So I will stop the Menti tool, and thank you again. Can you see the presentation, or are we still on the Menti tool? I think just still on the Menti.
On Menti.
Perfect, excellent. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't going back and forth unnecessarily, and we will get going with the rest of the presentation. So this evening's presentation is going to cover, as I might have mentioned before, a bulk of the background that we've been working through, a lot of that information gathering, a lot of the deeper understanding around what is currently happening in the town of Grimsby when it comes to recreational trails. And we also want to have a conversation about what recreational trails and what recreational mobility means in the context of the town of Grimsby, and what that means for next steps when it comes to trails and how we think about planning, designing, and implementing trails. I can say that through this presentation, you won't see any recommendations coming forward. This is really the early stages of the process. So we are really having a conversation about those foundations and some of those considerations. The recommendations will be coming in the later months. And ultimately, through our process, which we are working through, we initiated it back in July of this year, and we're looking to wrap up this project process in the spring of next year, will be the development of a recreational trails master plan. And what that means is it's a planning document that provides guidance on where, how, and what to design when it comes to potential trail routes in the town of Grimsby. Sometimes it speaks to some policies, processes, timelines for building, costs for building. A master plan is that really big vision and aspiration for the next 5, 10, 15 plus years when it comes to a specific topic. And so in this case, we're talking about that recreational master plan around trails, focused on the town of Grimsby and focused within that longer term timeline. And to develop that out, we have our technical process that you see on this slide, but we're also really leaning on the community and stakeholder and staff engagement that we're undertaking. And what we're trying to do as best as we can is provide opportunities for engagement where we're learning from those different audiences and those different groups, and we're integrating that into our process and then checking in to make sure we got it right and that we heard it right and that we interpreted it right. So there are a couple of different rounds of engagement. This is the first round. We've had couple of stakeholder sessions, meetings with staff, engagement with council and committees, and now coming to the public. And we'll do that over again in early next year when we have some recommendations coming forward. So this is just this first stage. We are already really excited about what we've heard. And that's what you'll be hearing most about tonight, some of those foundational elements and how we've started to integrate the input throughout this process. And it really is a perfect time to have a conversation about recreational trails in the town of Grimsby, not just within the town in other areas, but definitely in this context. We're kind of at this wonderful nexus where there's been excellent support at all levels, whether or not that's provincial or regional or local, to say trails are a priority. Recreation and healthy activity is a priority for our communities and for our governments. We're also in a really interesting time where over the past 2 years, people have been seeking out opportunities to be more recreationally active in their communities and using that as a way to be social and engaging because we haven't been able to in other ways. So it's this really interesting mix of societal drive and people wanting to get involved in trails, but also an excellent amount of support from governments and public agencies and interest groups that are saying, yes, this is where we want to spend our time and our effort and our focus. So it really is the time to have a conversation about the future of trails and to harness that opportunity, which is really wonderful that the town is moving forward with the development of this plan. And these things change with time. We understand that. We understand that there are extenuating circumstances coming up that could shift some of the priorities, but as it stands right now, recreational trails very much aligns with the strategic priorities set out by the town of Grimsby, previously adopted by council. And they fit very nicely into these different strategic priorities in a unique way. And so while we'll continue to monitor what that looks like, we're really encouraged that trails fits in well to some of those core pillars and foundations of what the town is committed to doing and how that could change and be adapted over the coming years as well. I'm sorry for the fuzziness here. Hopefully it's still readable. We have a great version that we'll be uploading to the website afterwards. But We also want to make sure that we're responding not only to some of those bigger pillars, but to the core socio-demographic, geographical, physical, cultural aspects that are quite unique to the town of Grimsby as well. And so we see a really excellent foundation of opportunity when it comes to what natural features the town has, where it's located, where you are positioned from a natural destination and cultural destination and feature perspective, some of your surrounding areas and the infrastructure that's been built there leading into your boundaries. There also is a great opportunity to start shifting because of the growth that the town is seeing and where you're located, shifting some of those behaviors or some of those preferences around recreation and around mobility to being more active in nature, no pun intended, and more trail focused. So we develop these profiles in order to get a bit of a better sense of how exactly that fits into different trail users, uses, and design considerations going forward. And we're still really starting to dig deep into what that looks like and have that confirmed out through some additional engagement, as well as some of the design considerations that we'll be talking a bit about later. And I've alluded to what we have heard already and some of the great responses we've received. I actually think that this has increased from when I updated this morning to even 140 responses. So we have had a live survey on our Let's Talk Grimsby page to get that foundational understanding of how people are currently using trails right now within the town and their preferences around certain design elements and uses, and also needs for improvement. And we're really encouraged by the amount of involvement we've seen here. And the responses and the trends haven't changed dramatically, but we have seen some interesting adaptations as we've seen more results coming forward. Generally speaking, we are seeing more of that age range between kind of 30 and above. So we are going to be looking to identify some other opportunities for more youth-based engagement as we go forward. Also seeing that frequency of use, and somewhat similar to what we saw in today's survey results, frequency of use being kind of weekly or monthly around there. So interesting to see that there is a high interest and a high participation already, and that there's generally quite a high level of comfort on the trails that are available right now. There are definitely some suggestions around potential improvement. And you'll see under those barriers, you know, the accessibility, the lighting and darkness, the length, those are all factors that typically do influence how comfortable people feel on trails. So not uncommon to see those along with that high but somewhat differing opinion around the level of comfort around trail use in some locations. People are typically, those who responded, I should say, people are typically using trails within short distances from their home. And that probably has to do with the access availability and the location where the current trails are. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But there could be some other opportunities for that greater connectivity, as we saw in some of the earlier comments, and some opportunities to start to expand what those opportunities for trail use look like at greater distances if there's interest in getting there over that amount of time, as well as travel. And last but not least, certainly, is the typical uses. And it is in that more traditional user category, I would say, though we have seen some shifts in the responses. So typically walking and hiking, but we are seeing definitely responses of dog walking and walking with strollers, and more of that involvement of kind of younger families and more recreational, but also somewhat day-to-day uses that tend to sometimes be covered in what we would call like an interested but concerned or somewhat comfortable category space. So we have a lot of opportunity here. There's a wide range of people of different ages who are using them, definitely high interest, some very intentional needs for possible improvement, and great access to current trails, but also opportunity for growth of trails maybe in some other areas of the town. We asked, Jimmy, I see your hand up. Yep, can I answer your question?
Yeah, previous slide, there's a stat in the bottom corner that has a 73% by car and 55% by walking. What does that represent? Because the numbers don't sum to 100.
No, so people were given the opportunity to select how they get to trails, and they could pick as many typical as they would like and rank them. So just based on those ranking numbers and knowing that people could pick multiple options, about 73% of the people who were responding of that frequency would typically use a car to get to a trail, and about 55% would be walking. So those are your top two. And thank you for calling that out. I definitely forgot to make reference to that. That isn't to say that it isn't a good practice to drive to get to trails. But when you see that number above it, where it's 1 to 3 kilometers or 3 to 5 kilometers to get to a trail, that's a typical cycling distance. And we also know that some of the trailheads that exist right now don't have sufficient parking or places to accommodate people who are driving. So when I see, or when we see those types of responses coming through, we see an opportunity for more of that encouragement and maybe promotion around cross-pollination for active transportation and trails, but also looking at how maybe we need to better accommodate people at the actual trailhead at the start and end point of a trail, depending on where that location is. Was that getting to your question? Awesome. Great question. Thank you for prompting me on that one. So we asked this question in the Mentee activity, and I had said that there were some overlaps, and definitely the case. So thinking about Grimsby now, and in terms of trails and Grimsby trails in the future, these were just some of the more common words that came up. And when we say the future, we think of that longer term, that aspiration, 10 plus years down the line. And what I loved in comparing the two was that there were some great reflections of maybe some of the not so positive things about the trails and how maybe we could strive to be better in the 10 years down the line conversation. But we do also see some wonderful acknowledgement of the great successes that the trails have experienced within the town, very picturesque, comfortable, relaxing, peaceful, making sure that people feel healthy and that it's a beautiful experience. That's definitely countered by some of those feelings that have already been brought up around a lack of continuity and connectivity, not enough trails, possibly harder to find. And these are not uncommon comments to receive in these types of processes, especially when trails have been happening at such a wonderful sort of grassroots level, like we've seen in the town of Grimsby so far. So similarly, in the aspirational, would love to see 10 years down the line side of things, the counter terminology, which is very predictable, connected, safe, comfortable, easy to find, accommodating all users in multi-use. So this is really helpful for us and with some great context for our team to be able to develop a preliminary trails vision and objectives, which we would be developing and adopting as part of this recreational trails master plan as the foundations and as the ultimate aspirations and targets that we're wanting to achieve by identifying a trails network, policies, programs, and recommendations through the planning process. So what you see on your screen here are the draft vision statement. So the town of Grimsby is a significant recreational destination in Ontario, providing residents and visitors with accessible, active, and passive trail opportunities. And so that's the big vision, the big aspiration for long-term down the line. And then the objectives give more tangible, specific, focused elements that elaborate on the vision. So in order to achieve that vision, we want to make sure that the trails are integrated, that they're part of a connected and continuous transportation system, bigger picture, that they are focused on providing opportunities for different users, prioritizing comfort and safety, that they are equitable, so providing direct access to all ages and abilities and prioritizes high needs areas. And by needs, we mean communities that could benefit from greater access to recreation or more healthy components of active lifestyles. Achievable, so establishing feasible and actionable strategies and supporting tools. So let's not put out ideas that will never actually be reasonably developed. Let's try to focus on the things that we can actually do, and while still being ambitious at the same time. And last but not least, maintainable. Some of these plans that I've worked on, that I've seen worked on, it really lacks in that area in terms of not providing enough support to be able to keep up to that standard or level that is so desired. And so we want to make sure that however the recreational trails network is built out, we can maintain it. We can continue to support it in a way that continues to drive that overall vision and drive the grander aspirations that we have for trails within the town of Grimsby. And I've talked a lot about what those outcomes could be. So how do we achieve that vision and those objectives? Well, as we continue to move forward through this process, we will be looking to develop a range of policies, processes, programs, practices, and priorities. I know that's a lot of E's in there, but those are core elements to make sure that we can actually embed trails into day-to-day decision-making that town staff and stakeholders are undertaking. And it really is multifaceted and has to be. We want to make sure that we have that policy foundation and support so that there's from all levels encouragement, and it's ingrained in that planning policy, that it's part of the day-to-day processes that are already in place or are adapted ever so slightly. We have education and encouragement programs that allow people to know more and to be involved more in trails and recreation generally in the town. Practices, so general roles and responsibilities, internal and external, and who's involved and what capacity. And then setting those priorities. What's important? What is something that we can reasonably do in the next 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? What are the big things that we want to be tackling, and how do we make that something that is built into achieving our overall vision and our overall objectives? So this really is the package, the foundations of what we are aiming to create through the Recreational Trails Master Plan. And all of this that you've seen so far in the presentation has very much been shaped by our own background review of existing policies, of some best practices and comparable practices out there, but more importantly, what we've been hearing so far and what we've been getting in terms of input from the community, from stakeholders, from staff, and from decision makers. And we were really wanting through this process today, through the public session, to start getting the vision out there and receiving information back to make sure that we're moving in the right direction and to make sure that we are on track, because we'll want to bring those through as we start to develop the recommendations and build out the network, which will be what we talk about next. But before I do that, I wanted to take a pause. Mostly if I have a drink of water, I may not get a frog in my throat, but take a pause because I know that's also been quite a bit of information. So are there any questions about any of the information you've received so far, or things you've seen on the slides, or anything maybe that you think we've missed in terms of those foundational considerations thus far? I will take the opportunity to have a quick drink, knowing that we are live streaming, so it'll only be brief. Okay. I'm not seeing any hands up right now. And I think hopefully everybody feels comfortable who is able to participate, that you will put your hand up and you're welcome to as we work through the slides. So I am going to move on and keep my eyes peeled just in case anything does come up. But hopefully you're not getting too overwhelmed by me talking so far, because there is a little bit more before we do wrap up. So we've talked a lot about the vision, the aspirations, the objectives, the big picture, and what we're trying to achieve here. In a typical master plan of this nature, again, I apologize with that pun, the foundation tends to start with the development of a network, the identification of routes and different trail types and linkages that are the basis for the plan. Where and what are we talking about when we talk about trails in the town of Grimsby? And we work through a process that we use, which is an iterative one, which starts with the foundation of understanding what's on the ground now. What is currently being used and identified as a trail right now in the town? And then we work through different steps and stages while building in the input from engagement, while thinking of the different objectives and criteria, design guidelines, and the context through field investigation, to refine and identify a network that is going to be realistic and implementable for the town. So what we can all endorse and support and feel confident about in terms of specific trail routes and locations within the town. And that's the network. That is the network of trail linkages. And it goes a bit one step further, where we then look to those phases and priorities. So not everything is going to be able to be built in the next year or two. This is a long range strategy, as I've probably said too many times already. But this is where we then also need to think about how we want to build that network out. What are the different phases and horizons? What are the priorities that are important to the community that are able to be implemented in certain timelines? So the network isn't the only piece of the puzzle of a master plan, but it really is definitely one of those core elements that is the basis for developing those policies and programs and practices that we talked about on some of the slides before. And what we've been doing over the past couple of months is starting to dive into what that network looks like now and what it could look like going forward in the future. Again, there are no recommended routes at this point. There are mostly considerations, and we're really hoping that through this discussion today and hopefully follow-up comments and questions, we'll be able to really start to hone in on what those routes could be and what we want to see in those locations. And as we start to work through that network process, there are a number of different assumptions or givens that are typically just going on in the back of my head or my colleagues' heads. And we think it's really important to bring those forward to make sure that there's a common understanding of what we are assuming or what we are building in as a given to our process. And we find this to be really important because the topic of trails can sometimes become a conversation, a much bigger conversation around active transportation or active mobility. And what we're really focusing on here, and we'll talk a bit about later, is recreational mobility. And so the priority is placed on off-road trail opportunities on publicly owned lands, and that's either by the town or other agencies, public agencies that are willing partners. There could be some on-road linkages, but most of those will be identified for purely connectivity purposes. But we want to make sure that there's a complementary design to those. And what do I mean by that? I mean that when you get off of a trail and you go onto an on-road route, we're hoping that what we can do is we can find those connections where you can put in, say, an in-boulevard multi-use trail, or another type of facility that has the same feel and same experience as what you were experiencing on the trail previously. But as I said before, it's not always possible to connect off-road trails to off-road trails. So we do acknowledge there could be some of those strategic onward linkages. We know that a lot of work has been done in the town already when it comes to new development areas, and that there are some planned trails in those areas. And so you'll see in the mapping that we have acknowledged where those are located, and those are definitely part of the trails network and something that we want to leverage through this process. It's been quite clear and evident that active and safe routes using trails is a priority. And so we are looking to destinations within the town and prioritizing those, such as schools or community centers and downtown areas in terms of providing that access. There's also another really important layer outside of the town's jurisdiction, if you will. So the Bruce Trail under the Niagara Escarpment Commission, some of the regional routes as identified by Niagara Region, the Waterfront Trail, any of the other trails like the Greenbelt Cycling Route that are identified by provincial agencies, absolutely part of this conversation. But those are types of partnerships that we want to continue to foster and build, because that really is their responsibility to be looking to opportunities to enhance those routes. We may be able to find connections, say into the Bruce Trail or secondary routes along some of the town-owned roads, or finding those areas of natural and cultural significance that lead to them. But we're really focusing on what the town has control over. And as I said before, fostering those partnerships with other agencies so that we can encourage their participation in trail growth and development throughout the town as much as possible. Nick, I see your hand up. Can I answer a question for you? Oh, we're not hearing you. Okay, I'm not gonna forget that you had a question. Hopefully it's a audio thing. Let me see if I can try to, don't think I can force I can only mute you, which I don't want to do, but maybe we can try, if you are able to, I know chat's not open, but if you have a question, if you're able to send it in to grimsby.trails@cema.ca, we can keep our eyes peeled for that coming in and answer the question as we go. Sorry for the audio issues there. We won't forget you though. We will make a note that you had your hand up about the trail assumptions. And hopefully we can get your question in sooner rather than later. So I talked a little bit about the concept of recreational mobility, and that really is what we are trying to encourage, enhance, and achieve through this process. And typically mobility has been more of a conversation around day-to-day travel and transportation mobility. But this area of recreational mobility is really starting to take shape and unfold, especially, as I said earlier, in the past couple of years as the demand has significantly increased. But it is a much more nuanced conversation, absolutely. And I don't mean to belabor the point or make it overly complex, because it isn't, but it really has a lot of different influencing factors and considerations, which is what you're seeing on this slide here. And so it's influenced by so much around the human behavior, but also the physical and tangible and intangible barriers. It has a lot to do with conflict and risk management, because the space and the opportunity tends to not be as wide and available as in other locations for trails. It really tends to be based on a demand relationship of where we're currently meeting demands for trails, but also where we need to see future opportunities. And also the idea of inclusivity and accessibility. I should change my wording there. It's not an idea, but the commitment to those two elements, making sure that people have the supports that they need to participate in a recreational way, but that we also are removing those barriers, and we are also making sure that people know how to and are able to get to those opportunities to allow for greater mobility when it comes to recreational trips. And it really just means supporting and encouraging and allowing people to be nimble between how they want to be active in a recreational way, because it is our free time and it is for fun, fitness, and more for our daily pleasure. And so in this case, there definitely can be some really unique influencing factors that tends to have to go into that conversation. And I apologize for all of the text on this screen. It really is meant to drive the point home of the nuances around the different users. So when you're talking about recreational trails, when you're talking about those types of routes, it isn't quite as straightforward as maybe designing an active transportation route, which I also do as well. But because it has so many different types of users, and each of these different users has very unique needs from an experience perspective, but also unique design needs as well. And when you have a space and when you have a location that is typically within a more beautified natural area, maybe a little bit more narrow in a specific corridor, we can't always accommodate everyone everywhere. And so when we start thinking about trails, we have to think about what the different users are, which is why we ask that question in the survey and continue to ask it as we go, and how we want to prioritize some of those users, but also integrate the design needs of others as well in a way that allows for those opportunities and greater access. I was talking about the ideal trail a couple of weeks ago that accommodated every single one of these users. And I think I have seen it based on a conversation. Well, I know I have seen it, conversation that I was having earlier in this meeting in Holland and in Sweden, actually. And it happened to be a trail the size of a pretty large roadway. And it was beautiful and it was wonderful, but we don't have those opportunities everywhere. And we know that. And so we need to do our best to design opportunities that accommodate the primary users as best we can, while also integrating the needs of some of those secondary users and considerations for others too, depending on the location and the context. And at the last meeting that we had, there was some real interest in knowing where the current trails are. And I think that's probably one of my top questions that I get in any of these sessions. Is there a map? What can we see? Where does it exist now? And so this map just shows what we have in terms of trails in the town of Grimsby now. We have a number of different route considerations, including some of the prominent pathways and trailways like the 40-mile creek area, the waterfront trail. We've organized them mostly by use, just so that we can get a sense of how they're being used and maybe how we may need to see some improvements. But of course, there are also the other layers of regional cycling links, or the waterfront trail and the Bruce Trail as well. You know, an exceptional spine through of existing trails within the town. But as you'll hear us talk about a little bit later, definitely some pockets where there are no trail opportunities, or where there are missing links, and where there are opportunities for more enhancement to give greater access. You know, looking at the south end, looking at the west end, if we have the commitments to the schools and to the downtown core and the community centers, the pieces start to form here. But not surprisingly, why comments around connectivity or lack thereof exists. We can start to see that picture definitely being painted through this map here and through the existing conversation. We went out and we also looked and assessed all of these existing trails and did a review of the current conditions and where they're located and their uses and their surface types and that sort of thing. And what we're going to be seeing at the end of this process is some locations where we may also be improving existing trails to either meet current design standards or the needs of users. And so as you look at these materials and as you possibly go through them again after this meeting, we would definitely encourage everybody to highlight maybe where there are some existing trails that could use some of that enhancement or improvement in order to achieve some of those bigger goals and those aspirational desires for design, accessibility, inclusivity, user-friendly, that sort of thing, as much as possible. Nick, I see your hand up again, so I'll just try one more time. I don't mean to put you on the spot. Do we have audio? Oh no, I'm sorry. We will continue to monitor that email just in case something comes through. Gilly, did something come through?
Not that I've seen yet, but I am monitoring. I just wanted to confirm.
Thanks.
I'm looking out for an email. Yeah.
Thanks very much. We will keep our eyes and ears out again. And I'd mentioned in that process as well that we are looking to and acknowledging also the previously planned and proposed routes that had been brought forward through either previous planning applications or master plans like the Rec and Culture Master Plan or the official plan. And so you not only have these existing routes, but you also then have a series of routes that could provide trail opportunities that are almost already kind of on the books, already planned, and we want to and are incorporating those very much into our process because we don't want to reinvent the wheel here. We want to make sure that we're building on what has already been done. And so great to see that there are definitely some gaps being filled in this case in the West End, as well as some of those extensions to the 40 Mile Creek connection and some investigation of some of the routes that were within the South End as well. Now, these all have different sort of levels of support. So anything that's gone through a development application, that would be quite well down the line in terms of a route that is likely to be implemented. Whereas some of the others are not council endorsed or council approved. So we probably will be going back to those and still investigating those further as opportunities to build in possibly to part of the network. So we also know and are trying to acknowledge as best we can some of the work that the town has done or some town colleagues have done in terms of those additional route connections. And that's also one of the reasons why we have the rail corridor going through the town as well, because we know that that has been identified as an opportunity and something that has already started to be explored in terms of a linear trail corridor through the town to surrounding areas as well. And this is just a zoomed in version of that map. We'll be uploading all of these maps onto the Let's Talk page. So please feel free to take more of a deep dive into them after the meeting and zoom in and zoom out. This definitely gives us a better appreciation of exactly where those roadways are and where some of those focus connections are. And that really helps us, as you'll see in a couple of the later slides as we talk about some of the additional routing and new route opportunities. And another layer and component of that process, as you may have seen in that initial slide, was around the trip generators and destinations. And There are a lot of great destinations within the town that are identified and that are promoted, but not all of them have the same type of influence or impact on trail use or the same priority level. So as part of this process, now we have that understanding of what routes are on the ground now, what's been planned, but now what's driving the trips? What's driving people using trails and being more active and being more, wanting to be more recreationally mobile? And so we looked at the destinations within the town and we've prioritized them to get a better sense of commitment of how we may want to build the network out around them. And so you see in that primary category, schools, bus stations, trailheads, services, and parks, and a commitment to having trails kind of right to the front door, if not as close as possible to those types of destinations, with really strongly designed trail linkages at that point to get people there. And that really is an intentional, strong commitment to make sure that we are accommodating those who probably need the most comfort and safety in accommodating trail use. And then we work down, and I don't mean to use that word, but we work down from there in order to be able to then start prioritizing and identifying our focal point in terms of the opportunities for trail use. So we connect the design with the access and to the destinations. And that helps us give a bit more of a catchment of where we could see trail needs so that we can understand what the connectivity will be. So again, there's nothing recommended right now in terms of the routing to those destinations, but we want to be as transparent as we can about how we're prioritizing them as we go through the process and what that could look like from a design perspective as well. And that is looking at the existing, the previously proposed, and how the destinations all fit together, and gets us to the point in the conversation where we can start talking possibly about some new trails, some new opportunities, some new links within the town of Grimsby. And the interesting part about trails is that there are a number of different components that need to be considered when you're thinking of a trail. And there are three that we tend to focus on ourselves. The first being the corridor itself, where that trail could be located and what sort of space it could be found. The second are the barriers. So what are the places or locations along that corridor that may require some unique design consideration or enhancement that makes it possible to go along that corridor itself. And then the last consideration are the start and end points, or the trailheads. So where we see a trip starting and ending, not as black and white as that, but what we need to have at those 2 points in order to be able to make that experience possible and to be able to allow people to access those locations. So not to oversimplify a trail, but when thinking of a trail, you do need to think a bit more holistically in terms of that corridor, the barriers, and then the trailheads. And delving a little bit more into that, we then started to look at and have been starting to explore what some of those opportunities could be. So the corridors themselves, there are 4 key opportunities that we've seen from the information that's been available from the town and through other public sources, including the unopened road allowances that are available, town-owned lands and parks and open space, railway lands, and easements. And these are just some typical types of corridors that we would explore. Hydro corridors would also fall within some of those kind of railway lands linear corridors as well. So let your mind expand into that category too. And we started to see that there were some great opportunities, some really excellent opportunities to start to achieve some of that connectivity through these different corridor possibilities. especially looking at the need to access the south end of the town, to access the downtown, to build on the existing links that are there now, to leverage some of the more built up residential areas through parks, and obviously the very evident and clear direct east-west corridor that is possible to get to and from the boundary through the railway lanes. And when it comes to barriers, while there's an abundance of opportunities, there are also some pretty significant barriers within the town. And we'd be remiss and probably not good planners or designers if we didn't proactively address what those are. And so there are also 4 pretty significant types of barriers that we see throughout the town that we will be addressing, and there are design solutions that are available, but it does add to the design consideration and ultimately the cost and the feasibility of the different routes as well. So the QEW being major roadway, even the regional roads can be sometimes a bit of a challenge. Waterways, they are sometimes beautiful destinations and vistas, but also need to be crossed at times. So not an impossible, but definitely not a small feat. Railways, they are both interestingly an opportunity for a corridor, but also a barrier as well. So at some points, you'll also need to cross those, and there are a lot of quite restrictive design guidelines and standards that are in place that are set by other agencies around the interaction of trails and the crossing of trails at those locations. And natural areas as well. We still want to preserve these natural areas and highlight them, but we also want to make sure that we're not creating any undue negative impact on them either. So how do we integrate the trail into more of those natural areas in a respectful and environmentally sensitive way as much as possible? And last but not least, in the 3 categories of consideration, the trailheads. So there are some existing trailheads in the town right now that delineate the space and identify the points of access and end, but it definitely isn't all made equal, nor should they be. So we want to make sure that we work through a process of identifying what those start and end points are and what's needed in terms of encouraging the trips. What sort of amenities need to be available, whether there needs to be parking, whether or not there needs to be more. And that helps us to start to prioritize and design out those spaces and also determine whether or not it's feasible from an encouragement and education perspective as well. So what does that all look like on a map? And again, I would very much encourage you after this session to take a look at our map when we upload it tomorrow morning, likely, and zoom in to all of these different features. But this map that you're seeing on the slide right now visually depicts what all of that looks like in the context of the town, what the corridor opportunities are, what some of those major barriers are, and what some of the trailhead or design linkage opportunities are. And when I saw this map, when I talked about this map with my colleagues, and when we started to talk to the town about it, there were 2 things that came to mind. Wow, first off, what an amazing abundance of opportunity here. And also, I wonder how many of these are actually feasible or possible, because we obviously can't do everything. And what may look good on this map may not actually be what is happening in reality down in the ground and on the field. And so that's what we did. We went out into the field and we started to look at what these opportunities look like and what's happening there. And we noticed a number of different things through our observations. And the next couple of slides are just a few of those snapshots of what we saw in some of these locations. And I will take no credit for that field work. Sam was out there. I think it was Thanksgiving long weekend, if I'm being honest, traveling with your parents and family members, not to out them, diligently looking at these opportunities in a safe way, I promise. And we saw just through some of those, pardon me, through some of those observations that yes, in some of the unopened road allowances and some of those areas where there are some great linear corridors, that there are some desire lines or are currently being used for maybe maintenance pathways. But in others, they seem very overgrown and quite naturalized and not currently being used. So definitely not as much of a foundation from a possible existing transition into future use type perspective. Similarly, there is some great existing sort of barrier crossing infrastructure or design elements that have been put in that could nicely be used and recognized as a more connected type of infrastructure or part of that corridor. So we have that particular bridge, which links some other park trail corridors that we saw as an opportunity that could create some of that continuity. There's also some opportunity definitely to enhance the signage and the awareness of trails that are currently in place. So the middle image, definitely, you know, you're on the waterfront trail, but maybe more local people would know that that little small black enclave gets you down to the 40 Mile Creek connection. But somebody who may be visiting or not so knowledgeable might not know that and might not be aware of that opportunity for connectivity. So we see some of those great opportunities, but also some of those connecting somewhat limitations right now. This is just one of the examples of the railway corridor and that interesting connection all the way across the town. And you know, this is one example of a very diverse corridor that has significant changes in sort of land use and width. There's a wide range of owners. So there's Hydro One, there's Grimsby Power, there is also CN Rail. So there are definitely locations like this one where it looks like it's well worn and has great opportunity. There's others where we're starting to see more restricted opportunity along that particular section. And last but not least, in some of these other areas, again, more examples of some of the unopened road allowances that could possibly be used for trails, but we know are possibly in discussion for other ongoing projects, whether or not that's at the regional or local level. And some ideas of where there's previously proposed trails that we probably will need to dig into a little bit deeper, like the culvert. You know, how are we going to actually extend the 40 Mile Creek connection through something like this and around something like this? We know that's in the works, but that culvert looks very interesting to me, and I'm intrigued how we would find a trail connection through there, but we are excited to see what we can do. So these are just some of those examples of what we had identified relative to what we saw out in the field. And there are a lot of other examples that we will be summarizing through this first phase of work. But in kind of summarizing and putting a pin on the head of all of this, in some cases, what we considered to be a potential opportunity, like the unopened road allowances or the easements, great linear corridors that could be exceptional connections. In some cases, they likely are not possible because of overgrown vegetation or the easements currently used for servicing. And we're working through weeding out which of those are the kind of not feasible options and the ones that are much more of an opportunity and something that we can realistically move forward with. Similarly, when we're talking about some of these major east-west, north-south corridors that we were identifying, whether or not that's along the railway or it's looking at some of the north and south areas of the town, there definitely are ownership concerns, not impossibilities, But the differences in ownership and some of the constraints in those areas, we do have to be a bit more proactive about engaging with those landowners and those agencies in order to make sure that we are truly vetting whether or not these options are viable and whether or not they're feasible from an implementation perspective. So that is where we are now. We have a strong understanding of what's on the ground now, what's been previously planned. We have some great input and thoughts on where we need to see enhancements in order to give access to destinations. And we now are working through the process and are close to identifying a more refined set of potential trails that could form part of the trails network through these different corridor opportunities with our field investigation results and through some more discussions that we've been having with other stakeholders and interest groups and agencies as we work through this first round of engagement. So that is where we are now, and that is what we've been doing over the past couple of months. And I know that was a lot to take in from a network perspective, but we do have a bit of time before our 8:30 mark. So hopefully there are some questions that we can answer, and then we'll briefly in the last couple of minutes just go over what we're going to be doing next and how we'll be moving forward with what we hear today and over the next little bit of time. Nick, I'm fingers crossing on this one. Yes.
I changed computers.
Yes.
Computers.
Oh,
So-
excellent. Thank you. Thanks
I don't
for being
know.
with us.
Now you have to listen to me though. That's the downside, unfortunately.
I can always
so
mute you. It's okay.
these questions are kind of at the time during the presentation questions.
Okay.
So I apologize if they're out of context because they're kind of at the end. You mentioned, that some of the roads, for example, were regional, and there are other bodies involved, like Niagara Escarpment Commission, etc. Has a conversation happened with the region yet? Is there a partnership being formed so that they're on board with the plan as far as the planning is concerned, and as far as budgeting is concerned? Because if it's part of the regional infrastructure, is there any support coming from the region? So that's the first question. And secondly, I've got a few other ones though, so I don't know if you want me to go one at a time, or do you want me to just shut up?
No. Definitely don't want you to do that. If you don't mind, we'll start one at a time, if that's okay, so that I don't lose my train of thought. Is that okay with you? So I'll keep it short and sweet because it is a positive response. Yes, the region is involved. Okay. The Niagara Escarpment Commission is involved. Bruce Trail is involved. Conservation authorities are involved. So anywhere we have assumed that there could be somebody who has, or an agency that has some jurisdiction within the boundaries of the town, they have been engaged and involved. So the region attended our technical agency committee workshop, and those other agencies did too. We're fortunate enough to have a positive relationship with the region, which is really great. For the most part, we're almost accepting what they have already put into their plans, except for those routes that are found on town roads, essentially. And they're open to that conversation on what may need to be improved in those areas. Okay. Your point about budgeting is a really good one as well. We're not going to be looking to regional roads to put new routes on them. However, there is funding opportunities that the region has identified before, partnership programs. So if there's an on-road connection that links two great trails where we could put an in-boulevard multi-use trail along a regional road, and the region would be open to having that conversation of funding partnership, definitely something we would explore and they would be receptive to.
Okay, because, I don't know if trails includes bike infrastructure on roads as well, because if it does, then the major pathways would be on regional roads. We've discussed many times, and Sarah, I know I bugged her many times about having a way of getting east-west all the way from one end of Grimsby to the other end, kind of like a circle route where it went, let's say, all the way down Livingston, because there's already bike infrastructure in place on a lot of Livingston, connected to highway to Main Street east, and then went down Bartlett so people could cross the highway up Lake. A lot of that is already in place, but it's not connected, and there's not one consistent path. So in order to make that work, it will require the region to come on board, and it will require regional money and a regional commitment to fixing some of those roads, because some of those shoulders have really deteriorated over the years and really need maintenance and rebuilding in some cases. But anyway, I don't want to get
it's a good
sorry.
point, if you don't mind me, Nick, to clarify and to build on that, because that was a great prompt for me, if you don't mind, to reiterate the fact that you have hit on the point of a great distinction. So this is a recreational trails plan. It is envisioned at some point that, and I don't want to put words into Sarah's mouth or anybody else's, but that at some point that the town would explore an active transportation plan, which is where more of those on-road routes would be tackled. Now, that said, in some of my earlier comments, I do hold true in saying that it's unlikely that trails can be fully connected. So we would like to try to use signage and wayfinding and some strategic infrastructure improvements for some of those on-road connections. But I can say that looking at regional roads, though they are some good links, are not part of the priority of where we're looking to enhance at this time.
Okay, no, because recreation means different things for different people, and I see a lot of families going for bike rides. I live on Main Street West, and I see a lot of families going for bike rides and riding on the sidewalk because the shoulders broken down, and if it's a small child riding on a sidewalk, I absolutely have no problem with that. But when I see adults riding on the sidewalk because they don't feel safe riding on the road, and it's for recreational purposes, it's not active transportation, it's not trying to get to work, it's going out for a bike ride for recreation, and they don't have the infrastructure in place for that. That's the only reason I brought it up. I get they're all kind of interrelated, obviously. So
Yes.
When you deal with one, you deal with the other. I don't want to take up too much time. I don't want to hog the space here. The other questions that I had were, has any of this been budgeted for yet at either level? Or is it just kind of making a wish list and going from there?
So what we will have in the plan are costs associated with anything that's recommended, whether or not that's routes or programs or communications. Has there been a set budget that is put aside for the implementation of this plan? I would defer to the town, but I don't believe that that's the case. We need to know exactly what we're looking at in terms of the numbers, and it usually is very much a collaborative process between our consulting team and city staff to come up with something that's realistic. I'd also mention some of the funding sources. So we're hoping, and we're going to be looking to opportunities not just within the town's purview, but there's a lot of good funding opportunities that have now come forward, either from the federal government or provincial government or grants that we want to also leverage. So I don't want to put words in the town's mouth, but at this point, I think we need to figure out what the cost could be for the network and for the recommendations, and then put some recommendations forward for what some of those funding streams could be.
It's just the only issue is budgeting is obviously going to be a huge deal, right? Because you're talking about small things that could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to larger items that could cost tens of millions of dollars. So if there's not a rough idea of what we're willing to spend on it, then we're just kind of brainstorming, which doesn't, I mean, it's great to brainstorm and that's a place to start, but unless we know what people are willing to spend on something, then it kind of makes it, you don't want to give people hope that something might happen when there's no intent to spend the money on it. That's my only concern. Some of the other thoughts, and I apologize, but I just wrote some things down while you were speaking, so I'm just going to get them all out and then give somebody else a chance to speak. Some of the mountain road allowances that you showed in your map, the unopened road allowances that are up on the escarpment, are unfortunately used by ATVs and sometimes snowmobiles in the wintertime. I think connecting them and turning them into a path would be phenomenal. I just, we'd have to, obviously mark them and restrict them for that kind of use, unless that was the intent to make that. I don't think that would be legal to make that kind of use available, but we have to make sure that they're not being used by those things if people want to use them for hiking and biking and other stuff like that. And the other thing I was going to say is use of hydrolands, although it's, it seems like a big deal, is pretty common. Is a pretty common use. I take my class walking down by the lake in Stony Creek by Van Ryan's Beach or whatever it's called down there, Hutch's. And if it wasn't for the hydro corridor that runs along the lake there wouldn't be a trail there. Like that land was left out of people's backyards because of the power lines that run through there. So if we could use the east-west power lines to connect Grimsby east to west, I think that would be a great idea. And Hamilton, people are critical of Hamilton, but I work in Hamilton and I hike with my class constantly, and Hamilton's pathways and hiking trails are unparalleled. Like they are phenomenal. That whether it's the rail trails or the Bruce trails and the waterfalls, their vision has, and obviously Hamilton is a major municipality, not like Grimsby. It's like the region would have to come together and do something like that, not just Grimsby. But it's an incredible job that they've done there, and so if we're looking at ideas, the way that they've connected their various trails is one that I'd love to see happen in Grimsby. And I know that that's not going to happen overnight, but if we have a plan that it's going to happen within 20 years, then we could do a little bit at a time, or budget it the same way we budgeted for our water main replacement. Let's say 25 years, and it's going to cost this much every year, and this is how much we're going to put towards it, and it's something we actually want to get done, and we're going to budget for it long term. Anyway, I don't want to take up more time because other people want to speak. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I'm excited about this. I hope some of this stuff actually happens because this is great.
Thank you so much, Nick. No, really appreciate the time, and I won't drone on, but the one thing I will say is out of all of them, probably hydro would be the easiest one that we could use in terms of trying to find opportunities for trails, maybe as opposed to some of our rail counterparts. So I definitely appreciate your comments there. And we've also been in touch with some colleagues of ours at the City of Hamilton who work on trails as well, who've been sharing some of their intel too. So glad to hear that you're supportive of those examples, but thank you. You kind of touched on everything that we know we need to address through this plan and be proactive about it, given some great ideas. Thank you. Rob, over to you. Oh, sorry, Nick. Rob, over to you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Nick. That's awesome. Quick question, Claire. Do you know a man named Drew Redden?
No.
You know a man named Daniel Salvatore?
The name rings a bell, but you're putting me on the spot. I apologize. Is it at the 30? I'll probably miss it.
Yeah, no, there's a reason why I'm asking these questions. They are the CN representatives in public affairs, and
that's why they're on our contact list.
They have come to Grimsby, and when I first proposed the trail rail system, which I didn't actually see that on the map, so I'm quite flabbergasted at the proposal for 5 years.
So it's on the opportunities. It's the big red line across the rail corridor.
So when I did my letter campaign, and Nick is, my voucher, we were actually shocked that the CN would come to Grimsby and actually have a conversation with us. And then we were even more shocked when they said that they would actually support us, assuming that we would get our ass in gear and and actually make this a reality, because they don't want to waste our time. And that was 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even 4 or 5 years ago now. And it seems to me that the line of communication and that CN is actually changing their perspective on these things, because they don't want deaths on the road, on the railway, right? They want to be safe as well. They're not actually concerned with distances to the rail either. They told us they're just more interested in having a collaboration. So I think now would be a very good time to reach out again to Daniel Salvatore, who is familiar with the trail rail system, as is Drew Redden, but he has moved on to a different post in CN. Because they are quite, they've opened an olive branch to committing to a collaboration.
Wonderful. That's great.
So I'm curious too, when you, on the slide, there was a picture 16. And picture 16 was on Oaks Road, and it was showing, kind of like a dirt path. On the left side of the trail. Now, my question for you is, have you received the proposed trail that I marked up with Tony Quirk?
Yes, we do have it.
Oh, you do have that? Okay.
Yeah.
One of the reasons what we discussed was Tony and I saw that spot on picture 16, and we realized that in order to do that and connect east to west, we would actually have it to do it on the south side.
Yeah.
Which is what Nick was saying with the hydro corridor, because eventually you'll have to cross the rail.
Yeah.
In order to get to downtown. Yeah. So I'm very happy. That means that Sarah got you the maps. That's awesome. Thank you, Sarah.
No, of course. Yeah, we have them. And so we have been, CN couldn't make it to our previous stakeholder meeting. So our plan is to reach out to them because Grimsby Power did come to the table and was very enthusiastic. Hydro One couldn't make it either, but is usually quite a willing partner too. So we want to make sure that we have some more focused conversations about, I know I've been in similar conversations where there has been, endorsement. I appreciate your comment about, make it a reality. I'd like to learn a bit more from them about what exactly that would take. And we also have some trail with rail and rail specialists that we work with and advisors that we can lean on who can also help us navigate some of those more sticky and technical conversations too. So we're definitely committed to moving that forward as best we can through the engagement and through navigating some of these approvals and some of the design and standard requirements as well as best we can.
Yeah, because basically what Drew told, and this is a bit of history which you might not have gotten. Drew Redden basically talked to Tony and said these technical things are easy to deal with. What the issue is we want to deal with a committee that has power and jurisdiction to make decisions, and we weren't at that stage yet 5 years ago or 6 years ago. We were at the stage of a proposal from a group called GAT, Grimsby Active Transportation, who had no real authority in the Grimsby Council. And now GAT has transformed itself into a subcommittee, and here we are. I'm very happy to see you after so many years. So would you be needing contacts and letters that I wrote and email correspondences from CN?
That would be great. If you're willing to share, that would be excellent to have. Yeah, just so that we really have the full picture of the history. So we're not.
I shared all of that blanket package to the subcommittee. I just don't know what materials you received or not.
For now, I think we just have the actual alignment and the routing and some of those considerations, just not the correspondence. So Rob, I'll make sure that we reach out to you after this meeting so we can firm up what we have and what else you can share, because that would be really helpful.
Great. Yeah.
I know I've taken 4 minutes more of people's time. I figured that people would be comfortable enough to drop off if they wanted to or needed to. But thank you for staying so far. We're happy to answer any other questions that do come up. But while I look for hands, maybe what I'll also say in some of those next steps, for us, we're going to be continuing with some of the more strategic engagement that we just talked about, some of those more focused conversations with the agencies that do have some of those authorities that we'd be looking for. We're going to be summarizing and coming forward with a summary of what we've heard throughout this entire first phase of our work on the plan. And then we're going to be really moving forward with the focused efforts on the network to work through the different options, to come up with the design standards and the design directions on different trail types, and then moving into some conversations around potential priorities and phasing. And that will all happen over the course of the next couple of months prior to some of the engagement like this that you'll be seeing. And I'm sure we'll also be having some additional engagement throughout the community, maybe in person, who knows, as well as through the Let's Talk Grimsby page as well. So please stay in touch. We really appreciate it. Jimmy, hand up.
Yeah, so my understanding is that you've got quite a bit of expertise here and have even done these sorts of processes for other townships in the Niagara region. Is that right?
Yeah, so I have worked with Fort Erie and Pelham and Lincoln and St. Catharines, and we've worked on some similar permutations, so active transportation plans primarily, but some trail focused works too.
So in your, I expect it's fairly high variance, but I guess I'm just trying to get a sense of like, you know, despite like coming up with a really good plan, does stuff actually happen, and like how long does it take?
So when I say, 10 plus to 20-year timeline, that is already a bit ambitious because things change so much depending on the decision makers that are at the table, what budgets are available on an annual basis. Nothing is fully certain in terms of the municipal cyclical process. And so we try to build that in as much as we can to the plans to make them as useful and applicable as possible while trying to predict change. So what does that mean? We have seen some great successes in these other areas. Lincoln has been diligently implementing a lot of their on-road routes and strategic trails through some of their capital projects, which was part of a funding strategy that we had to leverage larger capital projects to get some of these routes and these facilities implemented. The leveraging of development is one that should not be dwindled or lost. The development charges as well as the partnerships through parkland dedication and trail dedication. That is a really great opportunity when we know there's a lot of growth in Grimsby. So there is good opportunity that way in terms of building that into those new communities. And then similar to that, if you can try and have a monitoring approach that allows staff and other stakeholders to be able to update these plans in a less onerous way, kind of on an annual basis, so that we know what's being implemented and we can adapt the plans to be responsive to new opportunities that come up. I'm a big proponent of not having a too prescriptive phasing strategy. So just because we say something may have been considered for implementation in more of the 5 to 10 year horizon, something could change over the next couple of years, and we want it to be as flexible as possible to allow the town to move into that space. So there are some great successes as long as we can be as upfront about what the opportunities are for funding and for coordination and for implementation and maintenance, and build that into current practices as opposed to recommending brand spanking new things. That's where I've also found some success in my past plans as well, to try to build those out. But that's why we have a lot of these touch points, and why I'm constantly hounding Sarah and Olivia and others for as much information as they're able to share about practices and what's possible. And they've been wonderfully helpful as a resource that way, and really transparent in that too.
Yeah, so it's, correct me if I'm wrong then, it seems like the impression I get is that there's a subtle incentive for although you did mention like funding opportunities, I guess I don't have a sense of how common that is, but there seems to be the subtle incentive for like less ambitious and more affordable things. That's not a knock on the plan at all. It's just like that's speaking to the nature of like the cyclical thing, and politicians changing and budgets always being constrained, and everything is a trade-off, right?
I'd say if you look at a lot of plans, you don't get a 50-50 split, but you get a good mix of what you may see in some plans called like low-hanging fruit, and then more ambitious projects that would be on the longer timeline. So I would never advocate shying away from all of those bigger ticket or more ambitious initiatives. I think those are well worth working over the course of the next couple of years and phases to make sure you get to those steps. But, we also have to make sure that we're being reasonable from a feasible perspective. So hopefully that gives you some confidence that there will be both those quick wins and those great things that we can get off the ground sooner rather than later, mixed with those more ambitious projects that really make a huge impact on the community.
Right. Yeah. And in terms of, holding our elected officials accountable to the output of this plan and advocating for, what we want as a community, I don't know, like, I'm kind of caught in the mindset of like, in a town that's essentially dominated by automobiles. I don't want to start from the negotiating position of, oh, can we please have an extra 150 meters of a trail, right? Like it's kind of like, I don't know. I almost feel like should we be like harping on people to shoot for the moon, like to get the best version of possible? Like, how? I feel like, I don't know, like fairly powerless and not much faith in like fast enough progress. Do you have any like advice for like, the subcommittee or like citizens in general, like how to interface with municipal politics so that, we're effective in keeping our elected officials accountable here?
I think that's a really fair question. I won't come out and answer that one right now because I think that will have to be an ongoing conversation about the role of the committee and different avenues for involvement, which will definitely be addressed in the next phase of work when we're able to tackle that a bit more. But I definitely appreciate that it can be a challenge as a community member and a contributor or volunteer to feel like there's differences being made and the speed at which that's happening. So I won't answer that now, but I will definitely make that really important note to follow up with yourself and the committee on so that we can think about some ways that you can be involved in those next steps and make it feel like you're contributing in a way that makes a difference. Bruce, sorry. Last but not least, because I think I've gone over my time, if you don't mind.
Well, thanks, and I'll try to be brief. Thank you very much for your presentation tonight and to all those people, Sarah and her team and others who assisted you with this. I always look at master plans as being responsible for exploring all possible future opportunities. Because we know, as you said, it can't be done overnight. But what can be done overnight is what you're doing today, and that's identifying every possible route, because it won't be long before the town is coming out with its new official plan. And unfortunately, region's official plan, does not dwell on trails, but the towns can. And your work needs to be documented in the official plan as opportunities. So, and one of the reasons I say this is so that when other projects are being looked at, new roads, developments, someone can say, well, wait a minute. If we do that, we're going to create another barrier or take opportunity away. Later on, when these opportunities come up because of budgeting and priorities of council, then those decisions can be made as to what is actually constructed. And I would ask citizens and your team not to look at barriers, but to look at opportunities, because when the Bruce Trail got started by citizens in the early 1960s, look at the barriers that they had, and they didn't have any government funding to do that. And now Bruce Trail has multiple bridges, over 400 series highways, over creeks and rivers dedicated to hikers, and they just believed in the cause. And as they got those different barriers, they figured out how to work with them or work around them. So that's what I look forward to from your work, is outlining everything so that that can be documented now, because if it's not documented, we're going to lose those opportunities, and then we're going to regret it. We've already lost over the last 100 years a lot, or we've had more barriers put in front of us. So good luck with your program, and I look forward to its success. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Some wonderful points there. Really appreciate it, and agree very much with that point about leveraging the OP, the official plan, and that opportunity there, along with your other comments. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And thank you to everybody else for your additional 15 minutes of time. We really appreciate it. I think I might have mentioned a couple of times now, but I will again, that all of these materials will be put onto the Let's Talk Grimsby page, a recording of the presentation, a PDF version of the presentation of the maps. We will also be opening up some engagement questions just around what we heard. But please look at the materials again if you do have time or interest. Submit any questions or comments or thoughts that you have that came out of this conversation or that you'd like us to consider going forward. And we just really appreciate the time spent with us this evening and your ears and your eyes on the information, and look forward to continuing to work together on the next steps, because it's already been really interesting. It's going to get even more interesting as we really start to focus in on some of those opportunities. Bruce, gonna use that word from now on, those opportunities, and how to make sure that those are pushed forward as best as we can. So thank you so much. Sarah, did you want to sign off at all?
I had one more question, Claire, if you have time or no.
We probably should end at this time, Rob, but I would love to hear the question. So if you could please send it in to the email address that we have, that would be excellent. I'm just very aware of other people who are online who may have taken me for my word that 8:30 was when we were stopping, and I'm already going over. So if you could email that in, we'll be sure to connect with you after, Rob. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I feel like those people can actually turn off the computer if they want to. So the question quickly, you don't have to answer it, but on record, is if we could get involved in the priorities process. That's all. Thank you.
The simple answer is absolutely yes. Prioritization will be part of the next round of engagement for sure.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
That was simple. Thank you. Thanks for pushing.
So I think as we conclude the evening, I just want to thank Claire for taking us through the presentation. We're super excited about this work. Bruce kind of stole that story that I love, and I heard it as well with the Bruce Trail and just the path that they have taken, pardon the pun, to get to where they are. And I just think that really does inspire a lot of us as to what these plans can be. There certainly will be challenges and priorities and some long-term visioning that would be part of this, but I really think this plan is the critical component to seeing what those opportunities are and achieving them in time. So thank you all for your time. Some excellent feedback. I know you're all participating and following this project. As Claire said, please do follow the Let's Talk Grimsby page. And I encourage you as well just to subscribe to the page. You can subscribe to the page only if that's your preference, but it does mean that if there's news updates that we share on that page, you'll receive them. And it's just a great way to make sure you're keeping connected to the progress of this project. So we look forward to sharing that progress with you in time. And thanks again for giving up your time to us this evening. Oh, one really quick last thing is I do just want to plug as well with Let's Talk Grimsby. There's a couple other projects on there that I think would really interest this group, including the Casablanca Waterfront Trail. The concept is out there, which does include some trail component as part of our waterfront trail. And we are actively weaving that as well into this plan. So do check that out. There might be a few other pieces on there that you might be very interested in to see and to also provide some feedback on. And that's it.
Thanks, everybody.
Sarah.
Have a wonderful evening.
Yep.
Good night, everyone.
Recording stopped.
So Claire, did you want to keep